This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means? It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop Black Friday week starting November 21st.
His code name's Jackal. He's an exceptional assassin.
Streaming November 14th on Peacock.
He will kill again unless we stop him.
Academy Award winner Eddie Redmayne.
You're paying me to kill him. I am charging you for getting away.
The Jackal's here. Look at the exits.
BAFTA Award winner Lashana Lynch.
I will find him and I will kill him myself.
I like to win.
So do I.
The Day of the Jackal. Streaming November 14th only on Peacock.
August 22nd, 2019. At 11 p.m. in Kwanakgu, Seoul, a neighborhood gathered around a small villa apartment building to watch as fully geared forensic investigators taped off the area. The police had been called in to find 41-year-old Park Garam and her 6-year-old son, Shiu, deceased in their home. The cause of death was immediately assumed to be murder because of the gruesome scene that they discovered. The mother and son had been brutally murdered in the mother's bed. The police were speechless. How could this have happened? The bodies of Garam and Shiu were found by their family members. The brutality of their deaths left even veteran officers struggling to maintain their composure. The forensic team began to gather the first clues as to what occurred earlier that day. The first detail they noticed was the front door. The electric keypad had not been tampered with, forced open, or damaged in any way. There were no shattered windows, no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest forced entry. The densely packed neighborhood gathered and whispered as the body bags were carried out of the villa. The question on everyone's mind: who murdered Garam and Shiu? Welcome to Korean True Crime, with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Thank you to my patrons for making this show possible. And thank you to my patrons for being so patient for the last 2 episodes. I have been on and off sick, I swear, for the last 2 months since the school year has started again. But that's just kind of how it goes when you work with children. If you would also like to support me on Patreon, there are various tiers for you to sign up with. We also have a new sticker coming soon. Lastly, you can join us on Discord for movie nights of films based off of real crimes. Both of these links are in the description. Warning, today's episode contains graphic descriptions of the murder of a woman and her young son. We will be getting directly into this description following our theme song, so listener discretion is advised. In this episode, I will be using a pseudonym for the mother and son. However, when we get into talking about the murder culprit, I will be using their real name that was released in the trial. 12 hours earlier, Park Garam's older sister had tried to call her. With each call sent to voicemail, she grew more concerned. When both her calls and texts went unanswered, she made the decision to call their father for help. He agreed to help track down Garam's husband, Cho Younghak, who slept most nights at his art studio. Younghak answered his phone and revealed he hadn't heard from his wife since the night prior. He didn't share their concern that she wasn't answering her phone and suggested that it's possible that she had just forgotten her phone at home when she went out with their son. Garam's father pressed for their address and the code for their front door keypad so that he himself could go and check on Garam and Shiu. Younghak agreed to let them visit, but he said that he needed to stay at work. He couldn't go there with him. As the father, sister, and the brother-in-law entered the door code, they expected to find the apartment empty, considering no one had answered the door after they knocked. They didn't expect the gruesome discovery behind the bedroom door. The autopsy reports revealed that unimaginable violence had occurred. Bakaram had been viciously stabbed to death. 11 stab wounds centered around her neck with such force that it severed her spine and broke through one of her vertebrae. The killer then turned to the young boy, Xiu, and made 3 equally savage stab wounds. The blade must have been very long, they surmised, because it pierced through his small body and into the mattress below. The positioning that their bodies were found in was heartbreaking. They were so unaware of the attack that was coming. The bed was in a corner, and Garam laid on her side with her back to the wall. She faced her son, who was laying upside down in the bed with his feet near his mother's head. A pillow was covering his head as he almost fell off of the bed. As grotesque as the crime scene was, it was almost completely devoid of evidence. Both of the victims lacked any defensive wounds, suggesting that neither of them were aware of the impending attack, which meant it's likely they were asleep when the assailant entered the room. But how could one of them be attacked without the other waking up? The answer was in the efficiency of the attack. The autopsy revealed that Karam's airway and vocal cords had been punctured in the forceful initial strike. This strike would have rendered her unable to breathe or scream. She would have died very quickly from her injuries, with an estimate that she had died in less than 30 seconds. She would have lost consciousness quickly from the blood loss as well. Additionally, both of the victims were dressed in their pajamas, in bed, in sleeping positions, meaning they were attacked as they slept, utterly defenseless. They had no time to react. Despite it being unlikely Karam could have screamed or made noise prior to her death, the police were still interviewing neighbors or anyone in the area that evening that could have heard something. Neighbors who lived next door, separated from the bedroom by just a thin concrete wall, who said they could typically hear when Karam watched TV or laughed too loudly, they hadn't heard anything the night prior. The police had given the task of contacting the husband to Karam's father, who agreed to make the call. However, he had just found his daughter and grandson in that gruesome state. So when he made the call, he panicked and could only tell Younghak, "Karam isn't home." And Younghak muttered, okay, and hung up. Karam's phone buzzed in its evidence bag with a text from her husband. "I heard you aren't home. Where'd you go?" The detectives knew that a spouse or partner is the first suspect in any murder, but they needed to confirm if Younghak was home or if anyone else had entered the apartment that night. CCTV footage from surrounding streets and buildings were collected, as well as dash cam recordings from nearby parked vehicles. They didn't find anything unusual in any of the recordings. No one was out of place or acting strangely. The detectives began organizing the clues that they did know. The type of crime pointed towards someone familiar to the family, someone with access to the home. The fact that the killer knew the door code became a focal point of the investigation. The level of violence in the attack also told us that the killer harbored a lot of anger towards the victim. The quote-unquote overkill nature of the attack on Karam, 11 stab wounds with enough force to shatter bone, indicated that they had a lot of anger towards her. This was not a random killing or a robbery gone wrong. This was something very personal. Yet the way Xiu was killed was a contradiction. The pillow placed over his face suggested that the killer had some guilt towards killing the boy, or that they didn't want to face the consequences of their actions. It could be that they didn't want to kill the child, or didn't expect there to be a child. Regardless, they were compelled to kill the boy anyways. The attack on the child was also shorter, despite having the same forceful stab wounds. If it was indeed the father, this would fit the profile of a family annihilator. killing a family to start a new life. If it wasn't, then the motive was really unclear. The apartment wasn't ransacked or robbed. Nothing had been moved or taken. The only purpose of this crime was to murder the family. Despite the crime scene looking like a Jackson Pollock painting, there were no traces of blood tracked throughout the home. Given the force of the attack, the gore would splatter across the attacker, leaving footprints, smudges, and track throughout the home. The forensics team conducted 15 on-scene investigations to find anything they had overlooked. They were able to discover some idea of what had happened. Drops of blood were found on the bathroom mat and on a towel thrown in the laundry basket in the kitchen. The killer must have started to clean themselves up before leaving. The kitchen sink was swabbed for evidence, and there was the victim's blood found washed down the drain. What they didn't find is evidence of the husband's DNA in the drain with the blood. This could mean that the killer had worn gloves. However, there was DNA of someone that they could not identify in the drain as well. This detail was especially perplexing because Karam never allowed anyone she knew to come to their apartment. I mean, no one. Her own father had to call Younghak and ask for the address when he wanted to check on her that day. He didn't even know where they lived, and they'd lived there for over a decade. It is unlikely they would have had anyone else washing their hands in their kitchen in the week prior. Without a match to this set of DNA, it's just another mystery in the case. Within the home, there was also a complete absence of bloody footprints or handprints. Even the pillow placed on Xiu's head had no smudges or prints. This continued the idea that the killer had used gloves. However, having stabbed Karam, how were the gloves so clean when grabbing the pillow? Had the attacker changed gloves? The next piece of evidence in the room was the blood splatter. The investigators conducted a blood splatter analysis and discovered that the angles of the knife wounds and blood splatter for each of the victims was done using a different hand. What I mean by that is one of the victims was killed with the killer's left hand and the other with their right hand. However, both had the same force and didn't reveal which hand was the dominant one. This pointed to an ambidextrous killer, a very rare trait that would narrow the field of suspects substantially. The police were looking at individuals that had contact with Karam or the family. Again, Cho Younghak, the husband, rose to the top of the list. His absence from the scene, coupled with his detached responses to the news of his family's disappearance, and his lack of surprise to discovering his family was dead, meant the police were now trying to find anything to confirm that he was the killer. We've had a lot of cases where the police try to pin murders on someone who is not guilty, but in this instance, it was kind of like they knew he was guilty, but they had nothing to prove that he was. But before we can talk about Karam's husband and father Xiu and his whereabouts, the forensic scientists had determined the time of death precisely. To determine this, the contents of the victim's stomachs were examined. This is a common method of determining the time of death of a victim, right next to the victim's body temperature and state of decay. In this instance, the victims were found relatively soon after they died. However, they were in a hot, humid apartment with no air conditioning in the sweltering August weather. In a completely healthy body, your stomach empties completely by 6 hours after you've eaten. For some people, it's mostly empty by 4 hours with some remnants left behind. But 6 hours is considered the time it completely empties that amount of food. If you're someone like me with gastroparesis, this time can lengthen significantly. But Karam and Xiu didn't have any issues in their medical reports, so their expected half emptying time was 90 minutes and full emptying time 5 to 6 hours. We've discussed in previous episodes that people under duress can have increased or decreased digestion as a form of fight, flight, or freeze hormones like adrenaline. Within the victims' stomachs, they found a full meal. Earlier that night, they had eaten dakgomtang, which is a chicken soup, as well as noodles, slices of peach, and various vegetables. It matched what Karam had made for dinner that evening. Based on the digestion state of these foods, it was determined that they died between 2 to 4 hours after eating. Considering the other factors that aid to determine their time of death, it seems they died between midnight and 1 a.m. on the 22nd. However, the maximum time of death was between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. The police now knew exactly when the attack occurred. They could narrow down the CCTV footage to the exact times people were coming and going in the area to see if anything unusual was found. They were also trying to find out when Cho Younghak had been home. A little bit about Cho Younghak, Shiyu's father, Karam's husband. He was a 41-year-old rising star in the pottery world, not to be confused with Lee Younghak, who we discussed in the episode Molar Daddy. Cho Younghak had recently gotten some limelight on television for his pottery and nationwide exhibitions. While he is not a household name in Korea, he was well known in the pottery world, known for his passionate advocacy of the arts and a past decade of involvement in public art initiatives. He focused mainly on the more decorative side of ceramics rather than making goods like mugs or plates. On the night of the 21st, Younghak's movements were pretty well recorded. CCTV footage confirmed his arrival at the villa's parking garage at 8:56 p.m. His account to the police was corroborated by this. He had a late dinner alone while his family was getting ready for bed. They had already eaten by the time he had gotten home. They hadn't really been expecting him because most days he slept at his studio. He really lived a 24/7 sleep-deprived artist's life, or so he said. He tried to go to sleep at around 10 p.m. with his family and was able to get a few hours rest until he was woken by his son's snoring. He says he decided to return to his workshop, which was a 20-minute drive away. There were some red flags in his timeline. He says he didn't recall when he left the apartment, but it must have been early in the morning. CCTV captured his car leaving at 1:35 a.m. on the 22nd, within the reasonable time frame of the victims' deaths. He claimed that as he left, Karam had woken up and told him to take some of the fruit in the fridge with him. Offering fruit is a sign of kindness and caring, so him saying this really painted his wife as someone who cared about him. However, her family took a lot of offense to this because of how the victims' bodies were positioned. Karam was laying facing her child, but Shiyu was almost dangling off the bed, upside down next to her. If Karam had indeed been awake enough to say goodbye to Younghak, why did she not fix her son's dangerous position? He was quite close to falling off of the bed. Her family was skeptical that she had woken up and acted so kindly to Younghak, because as you'll learn, the couple was really going through a rocky period. If Karam had also been alert enough to stir at her husband getting out of bed, then how did she remain oblivious to the intruder entering the apartment just 30 minutes later? The investigators also were pondering these complexities in the case. Was Younghak's account a carefully constructed alibi, or was there someone who waited in the darkness for him to leave? There was a 2-hour window between his departure and the estimated time of death, which left room for doubt that Younghak was the culprit. But really, could an unseen intruder have slipped past the CCTV, murder Karam and Shiyu, and vanish without a trace? The police found themselves trying to find a motive for Younghak to murder his family. Because Karam had no enemies or stalkers, they couldn't find anyone who wanted her harmed or dead. Using her phone records and data, they found that she had a very large network of friends, and she was still quite close to her high school best friends. They even had a group chat where they often spoke about their problems, especially her husband. This shed a lot of light into their personal life because she often texted her friends stream of consciousness rants about their situation. Her friends assumed that their rocky relationship was why they had never been invited over to the apartment, which partly it was, but also Karam was a woman who liked to keep up the appearance that she was tidy and classy. The reality of her living situation was that she lived in a 40-year-old villa set to be demolished because it was crumbling. There was mold in the wallpaper, rust in the water, and it was beyond repair. She was embarrassed of her living situation. Largely, their housing problems had to do with the marital problems she had with Younghak. They had no money. Later in the upcoming trial, for Karam and Shio's murder, Karam's older sister told the judge, "When I saw their home, I understood why she didn't let me come to their house. It was not a good place for people to be living. I think if more people had known, they might have offered help. But her parents had already offered to pay half of the deposit on the apartment, so they knew they weren't living somewhere expensive." As far as the inside of the apartment, it was minuscule. And because it was so small, it was cluttered and messy. Karam was working full-time from home, as well as working as a full-time mother, with Younghak visiting just a few times a month. The couple's private struggles were coming to light. They married in 2013 and had their son a year and a half later. Karam had kept the same job since before they got married. She was a work-from-home editor for a publishing company. After they got married, she found herself as the sole breadwinner as Younghak's pottery business dwindled. He was relying on his wife's income, not only for necessary expenses, but to fund his artistic pursuits. This put so much financial strain on the family with a newborn that they had to move into substandard housing and live extremely modestly. This building they moved into wasn't the housing she expected to raise her child in. While Karam was struggling to balance full-time work and being a mother alone, she had to sacrifice all of her dreams while Younghak pursued his. He was oblivious or apathetic to their situation that was his fault. Her husband decided he would open his own studio, which was a big expense. They barely had grocery money, and he's taking out hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to buy a studio and pay for the bills and materials needed to run the studio. He's sending their family into greater debt just for his dream, all while Karam's scrounging pennies just to send her son to taekwondo with his friends. Yet, he is siphoning money from their savings account to get hair transplant surgery, a massage chair for his studio, and luxury cashmere coats. Karam had enough of him using her as a source of money and leaving her to be a single parent. She sat down in December 2020, 10 months prior to her death, and wrote out a long text. She wrote that their financial hardships were too much for her to cope with and that they needed a big change to be able to support themselves. She was willing to make this work, but things needed to change. She wasn't writing this text just to rant, but she had thought about how they could compromise. She suggested that her husband sell his studio and they move out to the countryside where housing would be a lot cheaper. There, he could get a studio for a much better price and make household goods to sell. He could work on his interior design pottery on the side, at least until they had enough money to not worry about it so often. It was a reasonable plan, and from her tone, it was just a suggestion. She was desperate for their lives to change, especially hers. She didn't want to live in a molding apartment with her son, barely able to afford healthy foods to put on the table, while her husband was sleeping in a nice bed at his nice studio. How did Younghak respond? He sent a wall of text, in an absolute temper tantrum. I'm going to read his text, but be warned, it's a little bit long. But just reading it got me ready to throw hands with him. He said, I got to the workshop and just saw your message, and it's all about money. You've managed our money so far and things are not good? Isn't this idea wrong? Changing from making interior decorations to what? Tangible to intangible? I've told you in detail, but the conclusion you made is that you can't make money. Your idea is the problem. I can't help but laugh. You think of my works as just interior decor. You say I'm not a famous artist, but who is better than me in ceramics right now? Who is better? I hope you understand what you've said to me. You think my prices are too high because of your narrow-minded opinion, and actually, it's ridiculously cheap compared to other mediums. Do you think I'm having a hard time with my work? Do you think that working is hard for me? The time I spend at work is the most enjoyable time in the world. I've never said I don't like my work. I clearly said it before we got married, that I value my work more than you. I won't make a lot of money either. I'll do my best, but you said you would earn money. Now that I'm not making money, you want to change our lives? You don't know anything about me, but you pretend to understand me, and you don't understand anything. Your message is centered around the fact that I have helped for 7 years, and now you can't help. I hate you because you don't understand anything, and you're trying to ruin everything we've done so far. Since I don't want to go through a complicated divorce, let's go to court tomorrow and file for divorce and get it over with. If you don't want a mutual consent divorce, then you should file a lawsuit. But if you really want to do that, send the paperwork soon. I hope you decide what kind of divorce you want and give me an answer quickly. Yeah, so like I said, Younghak threw an absolute temper tantrum. If anything, I think Garam was the one who deserved to demand a divorce first. Of course, we know now that the divorce did not happen that week. When he returned home that evening, they must have somehow, worked it out, because they stayed together for the next 10 months, on and off, demanding divorces. 4 months after this text was sent, Younghak texted his wife telling her to move out of the apartment because the lease was in his name and it was about to expire. The deposit on this apartment was going to go back to him, despite more than half of the money being from her and her family. Under the renting system in Korea, deposits often are very large sums of money, with the rent being inexpensive. It isn't just first and last month's rent like in America. It's like thousands of dollars to hundreds of thousands of dollars. In their instance, it was over $100,000. Pakaram was terrified her husband was going to keep all of this money for himself, and she was right. That was likely what he was planning to do. So she filed for divorce and seized the right to the entire deposit and demanded child support and half of everything they owned. Cho Younghak, from the time he sent that text until the divorce papers were served to him, had cut off all contact with her. But the second he saw the paperwork and saw he wasn't going to get that money, he came back home and begged her to stay with him. If they split, he would lose his studio, his financial support, and he'd have to pay child support. Everything was about money to him. It was then in July, a month before the incident, that he asked her to rescind the divorce. But she was already done with this relationship. She said she wouldn't end the divorce lawsuit until he agreed to give her the entire deposit, do what she initially planned, and he needed to get an actual job that made money. She must have known how greedy he was and how little he cared about the family, because she was using money as leverage to get what she wanted rather than his son. On top of all of this, Younghak was a terrible father. He was rarely ever home, and when he was, he completely ignored them. In their text messages, his wife was constantly begging him to come home and just spend time with Shiu. He didn't even know what day his son's birthday was when the police were interviewing him. In July, when Younghak came back and started acting like a doting husband, he became a lot more present in their lives. He was even going out with the family on little trips to the park, making time for them. But this came with the demand that she continued financial support. It was really just to make her happy enough to keep paying his bills. Because, keep in mind, he's only coming home to see his family like once a month prior to this. Karam stood her ground because she knew he was just doing this for the money, and she cut him off. She was only giving him enough money to cover necessary bills and debt. Yet this wasn't enough to cover all of his expenses because she didn't know about all of his expenses. He was only pretending to be a good father for the money. She never truly knew how expensive his studio was because he was spending money faster than she could give it to him. He had borrowed money from his parents, siblings, and friends. He had also started accruing dozens of thousands of dollars of personal debt. On top of all of that, he had not been paying for their rent or health insurance in months, and debt collectors he'd taken money out from were starting to call his parents. But what was he spending this money on if he was going on tours, to art exhibits, being booked on television? He must have been making money from all of this popularity, right? Well, months prior to this, he had started blowing off steam from his quote-unquote family troubles by going to a racetrack and betting on horses. All it took was literally one visit, and he decided to dedicate all of his free time to betting on horse racing. When he said he was at work, he was really at the racetrack, sometimes going 2 to 3 times a day. When he wasn't spending his time at the racetrack, he was looking up betting strategies and racing statistics. He was even downloading horse betting apps and getting absorbed into them. A lot of the debt that he owed to debt collectors was from getting cash advance loans to bet on the horses. He had close to $10,000 in debt in just a few months' time. And 3 days prior to his wife and child's deaths, he had less than $2 to his name. However, it was what the police found on his laptop in these days prior that would concrete him as the only suspect in this case. He had been reading the policies on his wife's life insurance and home insurance policies. In the event of her death, he would receive 175 million won, or close to 125,000 US dollars. He would also inherit the apartment and the deposit money. Younghak's phone would reveal a lot about his actions the night of the incident as well. And as the police went even further back in his records, it would reveal another motive. There was a phone number that he had called 2,468 times in the past year. That's close to 7 times a day. He wasn't calling anyone else nearly as often. And I'm betting you can guess who this person would be. He was living out of his studio for the past year or so and was rarely visiting his family. This number, of course, belonged to a woman who, when brought in by the police, admitted to being Younghak's mistress. They had been together since 6 months after Karam and Younghak got married in 2013. She was with him at the studio, she said, approximately 17 to 20 days each month. They were a casual relationship, but the mistress wanted to get married. And she also knew that he was married. He told her that he regretted getting married to Karam and that he had no choice and that he hated his wife. He wanted a divorce and eventually he would marry her. She believed him, and it probably is true that he hated Karam because he really only treated her as a way to keep living the lifestyle he wanted. I highly doubt he ever felt love in his heart for her. The mistress just chose to believe that he was going to divorce his wife and they would live happily ever after. I think what's even worse is that Cho Younghak's parents knew that he was having an affair and no one ever told Karam. They knew the entire time that he had a mistress and they'd even met the mistress. But they didn't care because they believed this is just a woman chasing our son and he's going to grow out of it and go back to his wife. I cannot understand their reasoning in this. I think what makes me saddest about this of all is that if Karam could have proven that he was cheating, she would have gotten a really good deal on her divorce. The mistress also had a lot of interesting things to say about the relationship with his son. She said that Younghak would always say that he never believed that Shiu was his, and that when the divorce finally happened, he was going to ask for a paternity test. He would always say that his son didn't look anything like him, which is a little bit funny considering the reporters who wrote about this would say that his son resembled him very, very closely. He was very delusional about his life and was always trying to get sympathy from someone. Moving on, following his discovery that his wife was not merely missing, but actually dead, which he discovered at 11 p.m. on the 22nd, he didn't rush home. He stayed at his studio until he received another call from the police an hour later asking him to come to the police station. The officers said that they were absolutely stunned by his lack of emotion. Everyone grieves in a different way, but this was so unusual. The officer who spoke to Younghak that evening said he was devoid of emotion, and it was as if he was daydreaming about something. He was just looking at the clock waiting to leave. The following days, he hired a lawyer, and the funeral was planned by Pakaram's family, rather than by Younghak. He chose to have nothing to do with her funeral or his son's funeral. Now, I more than understand having difficulty with planning your spouse's funeral. I don't even want to think about having to plan my husband's funeral. But he never even told his own family that his wife and son died. They didn't know until the Park family invited them to attend the funerals. When Younghak was confronted about his attitude, he stated that he was just in a state of shock from learning about their deaths. At the funeral, he spent the entire time looking at his phone. He was reading the news and in his horse betting app, not paying attention to the service or speaking to anyone else. After about 20 minutes at the funeral, he just got up and left. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. Karam's family was also acting very coldly at the funeral. They tried to prevent Younghak from even attending the funeral because they believed wholeheartedly that he had murdered Karam and Shiu. Just it seemed no one could prove it without any evidence. We're going to get into some evidence that they did find, but the problem is they didn't have any tangible, concrete, physical evidence. Nothing with DNA, nothing like the murder weapon. It was all evidence in the probability that he was the murderer. And you'll see what I mean by that. 55 days after his wife and child died, Younghak was arrested for the murder of Karam and Shiu, but in a really unprecedented way. He was arrested solely as the most probable murderer without a single piece of evidence that he committed the crime. You might be thinking, but we learned all about his motives. Well, a motive isn't enough to prove someone committed a crime. Look at Casey Anthony. The knife used in the attack was missing. They couldn't find it. From the stab wounds, they determined that it was a kitchen knife, likely stainless steel, that was around 15 centimeters long and 4 centimeters wide. The blade was incredibly sharp. Pak's mother had actually purchased the couple a set of stainless steel knives from Spain for their wedding. One of these knives would have fit the profile, but of the 6 knives, 2 were missing from the set. They tried to see if Younghak was carrying anything when he left the apartment that day, which he was only seen briefly passing by a car in the CCTV. He was indeed carrying a large bag, though. They presumed that the bag contained a change of clothes, rubber gloves, and the murder weapon. However, this bag and any of the items involved in the crime were not found, and he refused to talk about where that bag was. They couldn't find anything. I mean, nothing at all. They even checked the drains at his studio for traces of blood. If he killed his wife and son, he would have had to clean the blood off himself somewhere. He would have had to dispose of the clothes somewhere, and the knife and the gloves. But not a single trace of blood was found on any surface in his car, in his studio, anywhere he went. Now, his actions after leaving the apartment are suspicious. After he left the villa, he drove his car to his studio. The dash cam in his car was disabled the day prior, to which he said was because he needed to buy a new memory chip. So conveniently, there's no footage from his car. What they do know is that he drove to a gas station at 11:39 a.m. after spending the night in his studio. At the gas station, he went through the car wash. Then, he went to a barber shop and got his hair cut at 12:14 p.m. He was seen at the gym at 1:02 p.m., where he exercised and showered for almost an hour. Then he went back to the studio. All of these actions were pretty typical of an errand day, but they could also be seen as ways to destroy evidence. DNA was not able to be collected from the gym shower, but if he had had blood on himself at this point, it might have been noticeable at the gym, unless he was wearing long pants and a long sleeve shirt into the shower. But this all still doesn't answer where did the knife go. The prosecution pulled his electricity bill for his studio on the night of the incident. They discovered that from 4 a.m. to 5 a.m., his electricity usage went up drastically. This coincided with what happened every single time his kiln was fired up. The investigative television series Unanswered Questions tried to prove it possible or impossible to burn evidence and melt a knife in a kiln by recreating the exact kiln and temperatures his would have reached. They were able to completely reduce clothing and gym bags to ash, but the knife was only partially melted. I think it's possible that he only melted it slightly, and that was enough to throw it in a recycling bin somewhere and render the knife unrecognizable. But his defense stated that the electricity also spiked when other machinery was being used in the workshop next to his, which they shared an electricity bill, so this was partly true. No evidence was able to be collected from the kiln, and this wasn't proof enough that he had burned evidence. The prosecution brought up a really interesting point in the trial. All of this sounded too much like a movie. Perhaps it was like a TV drama. But what they really meant was that Younghak had an obsession with murder investigation shows and true crime. His favorite movie was Jinbam, The Culprit, which of course I will try to watch now and we should watch for a movie night. The synopsis for this movie states, seeking retribution for his wife's murder, a man does whatever it takes to find the culprit. One day, he finds out that someone is hiding critical evidence. It's not unusual that he likes true crime. A lot of people love true crime and crime dramas, probably you and me as well. But this film in particular was interesting to be his favorite. In this film, minor spoilers ahead, sorry, a wife is murdered with a knife as a weapon. The culprit hides the knife and the clothes and covers the woman's face as he leaves. The case goes cold. Younghak had watched this movie multiple times on his laptop just 2 weeks prior to his family's deaths. Further, in the film, the killer takes the victim's phone and hides it under the bed, which we haven't gotten to yet, but Karam's phone was shoved between the covers and the mattress. It was in a way that she would have needed to get off of the bed to retrieve her phone, so it wasn't easy for her to have accidentally shoved it there when she went to sleep. The last messages to be read on her phone were a little bit before 9 p.m. After that, none of the incoming messages were opened, and she was a person who worked through the night. According to her phone's data, it was plugged into its charger at 10:05 p.m. in the living room, and then disconnected at 1:27 a.m., around the time that Younghak left. 4 minutes before being disconnected, it was turned on and accessed a horse betting site. They questioned Younghak why the cell phone had visited a site he frequented, and he claimed it must have just been his wife accidentally touching the screen when checking the charge. The phone charger was also in the living room. Younghak had gotten up at this time and would have had the time to grab the phone and shove it into the bed. Garam never kept her phone in the bedroom because she was worried about electromagnetic waves, which was sort of becoming a popular health concern at this time. It's highly unlikely she would have gotten out of bed, grabbed her phone, returned to bed with her son in the middle of the night. The phone was also perfectly without fingerprints, even her fingerprints, as if it had been wiped prior to being placed in the mattress. The police believed that it was placed here to drown out the ringtone, but be found later to show the text he had sent her while he was at the studio, as if he had some kind of alibi. But then if she wasn't found immediately, the ringtone wouldn't be heard from neighbors and visitors. If her phone was off, then anyone calling her would have known, and that might have alerted suspicion quicker. Younghak's defense that a lot of these things were very similar to the movie was that these films were merely fiction and that he couldn't plan a murder in just a week. But this is contradicted by criminal history where killers have acted on even less premeditation. Going back to previous evidence, Younghak is a potter, as has been mentioned several times. He uses both hands when creating pottery every single day. He even has a YouTube channel, which is still up to this day, I'll put it in my sources, where you can see him use both hands with equal skill. It's likely that he was ambidextrous enough to be the killer. So the police looked into it, and they discovered from his parents that when he was young, he was left-handed. But now he writes with and holds tools in his right hand. All of this came up in the trial, by the way. The prosecution really presented a lot of damning information, but there was nothing like DNA or physical evidence like a knife. His older sister was there to testify kind of against him as a character witness, and she stated that his whole life, he'd always had very extreme emotional outbursts. He had tried when he was 26 to even take his own life, which he now has the scars from. His sister said that she was suspicious of her younger brother and that when he asked to borrow money from their parents, he always had a tone of voice that sounded like he was extorting the money from them rather than asking. Like there was always this looming threat of violence, like a mob boss. In the first trial, the prosecution sought the death penalty. A large portion of the first trial ended up with the prosecution talking about the motivation for the crime being money, and that it was also possible that Younghak had hired a hitman to kill his wife, but they couldn't find any evidence of this. The judge came to a conclusion. He determined that Younghak was responsible for his wife and child's deaths, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment on April 24th, 2020. The Supreme Court confirmed this sentencing on April 15th, the following year, 2021. As far as we know, he is serving his life sentence in prison now. His exact location is unknown. As we wrap up this case, it's important for us to remember that the real dangers are often closest to us. While justice has been served for Cho Younghak with his life sentence, consider these statistics. 76% of murdered women are killed by someone they know. Of those, 34% are murdered by an intimate partner, and 27% by a friend. Men are also affected by this. 56% of male murder victims knew their killer, with 41%, the majority, being killed by a friend. While fewer men are killed by intimate partners, less than 6%, it's clear that we all need to be aware of our relationships. I don't say this to make you keep one eye open tonight or to be paranoid, but we need to take care of each other. Check in with your loved ones because you never know what's going on behind closed doors. Stay safe and stay aware. As always, thank you for listening. Join us on Discord for free movie nights. Find my sources on Patreon. We have a quarterly sticker club up on Patreon as well. And please follow the show wherever you listen. Thank you to my patrons, Vix Mack, Lala, William White, Giwan Edwards, Nico, Elijah Hancock, Anomanom, Dr. Bob, Lumos, Emma Brown, David Tafoya, Adriana, Pip, Date 512, Lisa, Veronica, Olive, Caitlin, Sharon Evans, Nicey, Breaker O'Day, Kitten Who, and Ostabach. Daumay topayo. See you next time.